You are sitting around a fire roughly 30,000 years ago. There are maybe 40 people around you. You know every single one of them by name. Nobody here tells anyone else what to do. There is no chief, no ruler, no one who eats first, or sleeps in a bigger shelter, or takes a larger share of the meat. Everyone in this group is, for all practical purposes, equal. And if someone tried to change that, if one person stood up tomorrow morning and said, "I am in charge now, you will do what I say, and when I die, my son will do this after me," that person would not become a leader. They would be mocked, ridiculed, ignored. And if they kept pushing, they might be killed. For roughly 290,000 years of human existence, that was the system. Nobody gets to be the boss. And then, somewhere in the last few thousand years, somebody did exactly that, stood up and claimed permanent, hereditary authority over other people, and it worked. Not just once. Thousands of times on every inhabited continent across thousands of years. Kingship became the default way humans organize themselves, and most people have never once stopped to ask how that happened. So how did humans go from killing anyone who tried to lead them to kneeling before someone who demanded it? The answer takes roughly 300,000 years to unfold. And it starts with a rule your ancestors would have died to defend. For roughly 95% of our species' existence, humans lived in small, mobile bands of 20 to 150 people. They hunted, they gathered, they moved when the food moved. And they operated under what anthropologist Christopher Boehm, in his 1999 book Hierarchy in the Forest, calls a reverse dominance hierarchy. That phrase sounds academic, but what it describes is simple and brutal. In these bands, the group collectively dominated any individual who tried to dominate them. If someone acted arrogant, the group mocked them. If they hoarded food, the group shamed them. If they tried to boss people around, the group ostracized them. And if they would not stop, the group killed them. This was not passivity. This was an active, enforced system of equality. Anthropologist Richard Lee documented this firsthand in the 1960s while living with the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Desert. When a hunter killed a large animal, something that would normally be a moment of pride, the group did something Lee did not expect. They mocked the meat. They told the hunter the animal was scrawny, worthless, barely worth eating. This was not cruelty. It was a leveling mechanism. A deliberate social technology designed to prevent anyone from getting too full of themselves. Lee wrote about it in his 1979 book, The Kungsan. The message was clear. You are not special. You do not get to be above the rest of us. Think about that. For 97% of human history, the entire species ran on a single operating principle. Nobody gets to be the boss. The idea of one person ruling over others would have been, to most humans who ever lived, not just unacceptable but insane. And yet today, the vast majority of all recorded human civilization has been organized around exactly that idea. Something changed, and the first thing that changed was how many people could sit around that fire. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist at the University of Oxford, published a paper in 1992 in the Journal of Human Evolution proposing that the human brain has a cognitive limit on the number of stable social relationships it can maintain. That number is roughly 150. Below 150, you can know who everyone is. You can track every grudge, every favor, every alliance. You can govern by gossip and mutual surveillance. The leveling mechanisms that kept people equal, the mocking, the shaming, the quiet threat of collective violence, all of those depend on everyone knowing everyone. Above 150, the system breaks. You cannot personally manage 500 relationships. You cannot remember every debt. And when the group gets too big, the upstart in the corner can build a private alliance, accumulate followers, and grow powerful before anyone realizes what is happening. Here is the connection to kings that most people miss. Every king who ever lived ruled over far more than 150 people. Kingship is, at its foundation, the workaround that replaced a social system which only works when everyone can see each other. The question is how humans got from 150 around a fire to 50,000 in a city. And the answer starts with the decision to stop moving. Around 12,500 BC, in the Levant, a culture now called the Natufian did something unusual. They stayed put. Dorothy Garrett first identified them in 1928, working at Shukba Cave in what is now the West Bank. Later excavations at Ain Malaha, led by Jean Perrot starting in 1955, revealed circular stone houses, grinding tools, storage pits, and formal cemeteries. These were not temporary camps. These were permanent villages, and they were still hunter-gatherers. They had not invented farming yet. They settled down first and figured out agriculture later. Why does that matter for the story of kings? Because settling down changes your relationship with two things: the ground beneath you and the power above you. When you are nomadic, if someone tries to dominate you, you can simply walk away. You take your family and leave. That option, the ability to leave, is the ultimate check on power. It is the reason egalitarianism worked for 290,000 years. You cannot be a king if your subjects can disappear into the grassland tomorrow morning. But once people settle down, once they have built houses and cleared fields and buried their dead in the ground, walking away stops being easy. You have invested in this place. Your ancestors are in this soil. Leaving means losing everything, and when people cannot leave, the conditions for kingship begin to form, not because someone decided to be a king. Because the exit door closed around 10,000 BC across the Fertile Crescent, humans began domesticating wheat and barley. Geneticist Manfred Hohn and his team published a study in Science in 1997 using DNA fingerprinting to trace the domestication of einkorn wheat to the slopes of Karakadag in southeastern Turkey. Agriculture changed everything, and not just because it produced more food. James C. Scott, a political scientist at Yale, published a book in 2017 called Against the Grain that makes an argument most people have never considered. Scott argues that the first political structures that eventually produced kings formed specifically around grain, not yams, not cassava, not fruit trees, grain. And the reason is simple: grain is visible, it ripens at a predictable time, it can be measured, stored, and transported. In other words, grain can be taxed. A yam growing underground is invisible. Nobody can count your yams by walking past your field. But wheat stands in a field, ripening all at once, and anyone with eyes can estimate the harvest. Here's the connection to kings that runs underneath every crown ever made. A king needs three things: a territory people cannot leave, a surplus he can control, and a way to measure what everyone owes. Grain provides all three. The king, stripped of all mythology and pageantry, is a grain tax collection operation with an army attached. Every throne, every dynasty that ever existed rests on the ability to count someone else's harvest and take a share of it. But surplus alone does not make a king. And there is proof. At Catalhoyuk, a massive Neolithic settlement in what is now central Turkey, thousands of people lived together between roughly 7,100 and 5,600 BC. Archaeologist James Mellaart first excavated the site in the 1960s, and Ian Hodder of Stanford University led a major research project there from 1993 to 2018. What they found was remarkable. The settlement held as many as 3,500 to 8,000 people at its peak. They had agriculture, they had surplus, they had permanent houses, and yet every house was almost identical in size. Burials showed no significant differences in wealth. There was no palace, no temple, no obvious ruler. For over 1,000 years, a community the size of a small town maintained something that looked a lot like equality. So what was missing? If surplus and settled life were enough for a king, Catalhoyuk should have had one. It did not. Something else had to happen first. Someone had to figure out how to break the leveling mechanisms, how to make inequality stick. And the first clear evidence of that breakthrough comes from a cemetery in Bulgaria. Between 1972 and 1991, archaeologists excavated a Chalcolithic cemetery near the city of Varna on the Black Sea coast of Bulgaria. What they found rewrote the prehistory of inequality. The cemetery dates to roughly 4,600 to 4,200 BC, over 6,000 years ago, and it contains roughly 300 graves. Most of them held modest burial goods, pottery, simple tools. But grave 43 was different. Inside grave 43 lay a man, roughly 40 to 50 years old. He was buried with over 1.5 kilograms of gold bracelets, gold rings, a golden scepter, gold appliques, and a golden penis sheath. At that date, roughly 4,500 BC, this was more gold than had been found anywhere else in the world for that entire period. One person, in one grave, with more accumulated wealth than entire civilizations possessed. And it was not just the gold. The distribution across the cemetery showed a clear pattern. A few graves were extraordinarily rich. Most were modest. Some were empty of goods entirely. This is not a community of equals. This is a community with a top, a middle, and a bottom. This is hierarchy, carved in gold and buried in the ground over 6,000 years ago, over 1,000 years before the first known kings of Mesopotamia or Egypt. Nobody knows this man's name. Nobody knows exactly what his title was. But someone in that community was buried with a scepter, the universal symbol of royal authority, before the concept of royalty had an official name. The hardware was already in place. The word for it came later. So how does a species that spends 290,000 years enforcing equality end up burying one man with a golden scepter? The answer involves a transitional figure that most people have never heard of. The Big Man in 1963, anthropologist Marshall Salins published a paper called Poor Man, Rich Man, Big Man, Chief that described a type of leader found across Melanesia and other small-scale societies. A big man is not born into power. He earns it. He accumulates wealth, not to keep it, but to give it away. He hosts massive feasts. He gives extravagant gifts. And every gift creates a debt. Every feast creates an obligation. The people who eat his food and accept his generosity owe him, socially and psychologically. He does not command. He persuades. He does not inherit power. He builds it from scratch, one feast at a time. Here's the catch. A big man's power dies with him. His son does not automatically become the next big man. He has to start over. And that is the gap between a big man and a king. A king's power is inherited. His son is born into authority. The entire system is designed to ensure that power transfers automatically from one generation to the next, whether the son earned it or not. Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus traced exactly how that gap was closed in their 2012 book, The Creation of Inequality. They identified the mechanisms across multiple civilizations. Ambitious individuals figured out how to override the old leveling mechanisms, usually by doing one of two things: claiming a special relationship with the gods or controlling stored surplus. If you can convince people that your family has a unique connection to the divine, then your authority is not personal. It is cosmic. Your son inherits not just your wealth, but your spiritual mandate. And if you control the granary, you control who eats and who starves. That is not persuasion anymore. That is coercion. And coercion wrapped in a sacred story is a king. The clearest example of this entire transition, from religious authority to royal power, happened in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, in the city of Uruk around 3500 to 3000 BC. The temple was the center of everything. The temple managed the land. The temple collected the grain. The temple distributed rations to workers. The temple employed scribes who kept track of who owed what to whom. The head of the temple, the person who controlled this entire redistributive economy, held the title of En, essentially a high priest. The En was the most powerful person in the city, not because he had an army, because he controlled the food supply, but cities attract enemies, and enemies require soldiers. When Uruk and other Sumerian city-states began fighting each other over territory and water rights, the priestly establishment had a problem. Priests are not warriors. They needed someone to lead the army. That person was called a lugal, a word that literally means big man in Sumerian. The lugal was supposed to be a temporary position, a war leader appointed for the duration of the crisis, who would step down when the fighting was over. Some of them did not step down. Once a lugal had an army, he had something the priests did not: armed men who followed his orders. And an army loyal to you personally is the one thing that every leveling mechanism in human history is powerless against. You cannot mock a man into stepping down if he has 500 soldiers standing behind him. The lugal merged military power with the temple's religious authority, and the result was a king, not a priest, not a war leader, something new, someone who controlled the economy, commanded the army, and spoke for the gods all at once. That combination, wealth plus violence plus divine legitimacy, is the formula for kingship. It has not changed in 5,000 years. The Sumerian king list, a clay document compiled around 2000 BC from older records, begins with a phrase that tells you everything about how ancient people understood kingship. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not invented, not established, descended from heaven. That is not a factual statement. That is political theology. The king was not a human who seized power. He was a vessel chosen by the gods, and the mythology was inseparable from the institution. The list names legendary early kings like Etana of Kish, who supposedly ascended to heaven and was possibly the first ruler to unite multiple Sumerian cities under a single authority. It names Meskia, Gashur, and Enmerkar as rulers of Uruk, and it names Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who became the central figure of the oldest surviving work of literature. Whether Gilgamesh was a real historical figure or a mythologized composite, the poem that carries his name, written roughly 4,000 years ago, is fundamentally about the nature and limits of kingship. A king who is 2/3 god and 1/3 man, who has everything any human could want and who still cannot escape death. Think about that. The very first great work of literature humans ever produced was about a king. Before we wrote love stories, before we wrote comedies. Before we wrote philosophy, we wrote about the problem of absolute power. Kingship was so central to early human thought that it became the first story worth carving into clay. And the first visual propaganda about kingship was carved in stone around the same time. The Warka vase, found in the temple of the goddess Inanna at Uruk and dating to roughly 3200 to 3000 BC, is one of the oldest narrative relief sculptures ever discovered. It is a meter-tall alabaster vessel decorated in horizontal registers that read from bottom to top. At the bottom, water and plants. Above that, animals. Above that, naked laborers carrying baskets of agricultural surplus. And at the very top, a figure who is taller than everyone else, fully clothed, presenting those offerings to the goddess. That figure is the king. And the vase tells you exactly what the king's job is supposed to be. He stands between the people and the gods. He takes the surplus from the workers and delivers it to the divine. Without him, according to this story, the gods are not fed. And if the gods are not fed, the crops do not grow. The king is the indispensable middleman. Remove him and the system collapses. That is the pitch. That is what every king has told every subject for the last 5,000 years. The standard of reinforces it from a different angle. Found in the royal cemetery at by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and dated to roughly 2600 BC, it is a hollow wooden box inlaid with lapis lazuli, shell, and red limestone. One side shows war, chariots trampling fallen enemies, soldiers marching captured prisoners, and at the top, the king drawn taller than everyone else, standing at the center. The other side shows peace, workers bringing animals and goods to a royal banquet. Musicians playing. And again, the king, larger than everyone, seated at the top. Two sides of the same argument. In war, the king protects you. In peace, the king feeds you. Either way, you need a king. It is one of the earliest known pieces of political advertising, and it works the same way political advertising works today. Fear and provision, stick and carrot. And the royal cemetery of held something far more disturbing than propaganda. Woolley, excavating between 1922 and 1934, found what he called the death pits. In the tomb of Queen Puabi, roughly 2600 BC, he found the queen's body alongside 52 attendants. Servants, guards, musicians, all lying in orderly rows with no signs of struggle. They had been drugged or poisoned, and they had gone willingly or at least without resistance into the grave of their ruler. Other royal tombs in the cemetery contain similar mass burials. In one, 74 bodies. Think about what that means. By 2600 BC, the concept of kingship was so deeply embedded, so absolute, that dozens of people would follow their queen into death. Not because they were dragged in kicking and screaming, because the idea that royal authority extended beyond the grave was simply how the world worked. You served in life, you served in death. That is not a political system, that is a religion, and kingship from the very beginning was always both. While Mesopotamian kings positioned themselves as servants of the gods, Egypt went further. The Egyptian pharaoh was not a representative of the divine. He was divine, a living god walking on earth. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, around 3100 BC, traditionally attributed to a ruler named Narmer, sometimes equated with the legendary Menes, produced the world's first nation-scale divine monarchy. Before Narmer, pre-dynastic rulers had already begun consolidating power. A figure known as the Scorpion King, depicted on a ceremonial mace head smiting enemies and presiding over irrigation projects, shows that the machinery of royal authority was being assembled before unification was complete. But the Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis by James Quibell and Frederick Green in 1898, shows the finished product. Narmer wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt, smashing the skull of a kneeling enemy with a mace. One man. Two lands, united by violence. The message is not subtle. Egyptian pharaohs were considered incarnations of Horus, the falcon god, while they lived and became identified with Osiris, the god of the dead, after they died. This was not metaphor. This was theology. To defy the pharaoh was to defy a god. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the cosmic order itself. The divine kingship model solved a problem that secular kingship could not. If your authority comes from military power, someone with a bigger army can take it from you. If your authority comes from being a god, it is beyond debate. You cannot vote a god out of office. And pharaonic authority was not just religious. The pharaoh controlled the Nile, or rather, his rituals were believed to ensure the annual flooding that made agriculture possible. When the Nile rose, the pharaoh had earned the gift of the gods. When the Nile failed, the pharaoh had failed. His legitimacy depended on the river. which means Egyptian divine kingship was, under the mythology, still a grain operation. The god king's job was to make the wheat grow, 5,000 years of elaborate theology, and at the bottom of it sits the same problem: feed the people or lose the throne. China invented a different answer to the same question. During the Shang dynasty, roughly 1600 to 1046 BC, kings functioned as high priests, using oracle bones, turtle shells, and ox shoulder blades to communicate with their ancestors and the supreme deity Shangdi. The king cracked the bones with hot bronze rods, read the fracture patterns as divine messages, and recorded the results. Thousands of these inscribed oracle bones have survived. Kingship was, in the Shang system, fundamentally religious. The king was the only person who could speak directly to the divine realm. Without him, the gods were unreachable. Without the gods, the harvests failed. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. And then the Zhou overthrew the Shang in 1046 BC. They had a problem. If the Shang king's authority was divine and hereditary, then the Zhou had just committed cosmic treason. They needed a new theory. So they invented one: the mandate of heaven, Tianming. The idea that heaven grants the right to rule, but conditionally. If a king governs justly, heaven supports him. If he governs badly, heaven withdraws its mandate, and rebellion becomes not just legitimate, but divinely ordained. Earthquakes, floods, famines, these were not natural disasters. They were heaven's performance review. Here is the thread that connects every one of these systems to the broader story. Every system of kingship has to answer the same question: why should anyone obey this person? Mesopotamia answered, because the gods chose him. Egypt answered, because he is a god. China answered, because heaven granted him authority, but only as long as he deserves it. Each answer is different, but each one does the same thing. It takes a claim that is fundamentally political, one person's power over others, and wraps it in a story that makes it feel natural, inevitable, sacred. Without that story, a king is just a man with an army. With it, he is the axis around which the world turns. Robert Carnero, an anthropologist at the American Museum of Natural History, published a paper in Science in August of 1970 that offered one of the most elegant explanations for why kings appeared when and where they did. His theory is called environmental circumscription. The argument is straightforward. Agriculture by itself does not create kings. You can farm and still live in an egalitarian village. But when agricultural populations are surrounded by geographic barriers, deserts, mountains, oceans, growing populations compete for a fixed amount of farmland. When war breaks out, the losers cannot pack up and leave. There's nowhere to go. They get absorbed into the winner's territory. Village absorbs village, chiefdom absorbs chiefdom, and the winner needs a permanent system of control over the conquered. That system is a state, and the person at the top of that state is a king. Carnero pointed to the Nile Valley, hemmed in by desert on both sides, coastal Peru, where narrow river valleys are pinched between the Andes and the Pacific, and the Tigris-Euphrates Plain, all places where the earliest independent states emerged. The king in this view is partly the product of geography. Not because geography creates leaders, but because geography removes the option of escape. When you cannot run, you negotiate, and when you lose the negotiation, you obey. Think about that for a second. The original check on human power, the one that kept people equal for 290,000 years, was the ability to walk away. The desert removed it, the mountain removed it, the ocean removed it, and the king stepped into the space that geography created. And there is one more layer underneath all of this, the one inside your head. Humans share a common ancestor with chimpanzees who operate under strict alpha male dominance hierarchies. The alpha chimp eats first, mates first, and maintains position through physical intimidation and strategic alliances. Christopher Boehm's central argument is that early humans did not lack the capacity for dominance. They suppressed it. The reverse dominance hierarchy was not the absence of a power drive. It was the collective containment of a power drive that was always there, built into the primate brain, waiting for conditions to change. Agriculture changed those conditions. Settled life changed those conditions. Surplus changed those conditions. And when the leveling mechanisms broke down, because the group was too large for everyone to know each other, because stored grain gave ambitious individuals something to monopolize, because geography trapped people in place, the old primate hierarchy re-emerged, not as an alpha chimp with bigger muscles, but as a king with a crown, a granary, and a story about why the gods chose him. The hardware was always there. Kingship was just the software update. But here is something worth pausing on, because it complicates the story in a way that most histories leave out. Not every civilization invented kings. Between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, the Indus Valley Civilization, centered at sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in what is now Pakistan, became one of the largest and most sophisticated urban civilizations in the ancient world. Their cities were built on precise grids. Their bricks were standardized across sites separated by over 1,000 kilometers, all following the exact same 1:2 to 4-dimensional ratio. They had standardized weights, drainage systems that would not be matched in Europe for thousands of years, a writing system that no one has been able to read. And yet, as archaeologist Gregory Possehl argued in his 2002 book The Indus Civilization, there is almost no evidence of kings, no palaces, no monumental royal tombs, no giant statues of rulers, no images of armies or conquests. Jonathan Mark Knoyer at the University of Wisconsin has proposed that the Indus Valley may have functioned as a confederation, governed not by a single monarch, but by merchant councils and ritual elites who maintained order through shared economic standards rather than military force. If that is true, and the debate is far from settled, then the Indus Valley is proof that kingship was not the only possible outcome. A civilization of hundreds of thousands of people maintained urban order for 7 centuries without a king. They used weights and measures and standardized bricks instead of crowns and scepters, which means kingship was not inevitable. It was one answer to the problem of organizing people at scale. It was just by far the most common one. So here is the answer. How did humans invent kings? They did it in layers. For 290,000 years, humans lived in small, egalitarian bands where collective leveling mechanisms, mockery, shaming, ostracism, and violence prevented any individual from seizing permanent power. That system worked because groups were small enough for everyone to know each other, and because anyone who did not like it could walk away. Then, starting roughly 12,500 years ago, people began to settle down, tying themselves to specific land. Agriculture followed, creating storable, measurable surplus, especially grain, that could be controlled and taxed. Communities grew beyond 150 people, overwhelming the brain's capacity to manage social relationships through personal knowledge. The old leveling mechanisms stopped working. Ambitious individuals discovered they could accumulate power by controlling food stores and claiming divine endorsement. Temporary prestige became hereditary rank. Hereditary rank became hereditary authority. In Mesopotamia, temple priests who managed grain redistribution gave way to military leaders, lugals, who refused to step down after wars ended. In Egypt, a conquering ruler declared himself a living god and unified an entire river valley under one crown. In China, kings ruled as high priests, channeling divine authority through cracked oracle bones. In every case, the formula was the same: surplus plus coercion plus a sacred story equals a king. Was this inevitable? Carnero's circumscription theory, Boehm's reverse dominance hypothesis, Flannery and Marcus's analysis of how leveling mechanisms were overridden, and the archaeological record from Varna to all point in the same direction. Given agriculture, storable surplus, population growth, geographic constraints, and the latent primate drive for dominance, some form of hierarchical hereditary rule was extremely likely to emerge. The probability that humans would invent kingship, given the conditions that developed after the Neolithic Revolution, is roughly 90 to 95%. The Indus Valley proves it was not 100%. Other models were possible. But the king was the most common solution by a wide margin because it combined economic control, military power, and religious legitimacy in a single transferable package. Nothing else was that efficient. Nothing else was that durable. Tonight, you live in a world built by kings, tax collection, standing armies, bureaucracies, written law, territorial borders. All of them were invented by kings or for kings. The kings are mostly gone now, replaced by constitutions and elections and parliaments, but the architecture they built is still standing. Every government you have ever lived under is a renovated monarchy with the crown removed and the foundation left in place. You did not choose it. Nobody alive chose it. But someone, roughly 6,000 years ago, stood up in front of people who had spent 290,000 years insisting that nobody gets to be the boss and said, "I am the boss," and somehow this time nobody stopped him. If this one got you thinking, hit like and share it with someone who would enjoy it. Subscribe if you want more of these. And let me know in the comments, what should we try next? There's another video on screen right now that I think you're going to want to see.